Hello there, welcome to episode 62 of Sitting Now. Joining me back in his rightful throne are my other co-host. Now it's been the co-host seat's been dominated for the last by the usurper.
I thought this was a different bottom crease in the cushion, but yes.
Yeah. But what have you been up to? Where have you been?
I've been engaged in various ritual activities, but that is what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis anyway.
Yeah.
And I guess a bunch of them need to be undisclosed for the time being.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. We have an exciting project coming up from Mr. Black here. I should introduce you. This is Ulysses Black in case you're new to the show. But
hello.
Yeah. Anyway, so this week we have a returning guest and companion, Mr. Peter Gray and Alkistis Dimech. And yes, this week we're covering a topic. I keep saying this like almost every week at the moment because we're kind of going over these kind of grand figures of occult mythology a lot of the time, or kind of folklore. We've had Spring-Heeled Jack and stuff. But obviously Babalon is something we really should have covered again, probably quite a long time ago on Sitting Now.
And in fact we probably could do with covering again in a couple of years' time. A refresher on it. But these guys from Scarlet Imprint, the occult publishing company, brought to the 21st century the subject of the Goddess Babalon, and we're going to have a chat with them. We're going to talk a little bit, I guess, about Scarlet Imprint and publishing and its role in the modern occult world, but actually I think we're going to try and get under the skin a little bit and actually just talk to them as people about their relationship with it all. Mm-hmm. And try and see, there is this enormous occult publishing company, that I say enormous within the occult world, enormous, and extremely, produce very fine books. But this is an opportunity to actually find out a bit more about them as people, and what drives them and what motivates them and what their relationship with that goddess Babalon is.
That's kind of often overlooked, isn't it, when you're looking at these kind of occult subjects? Is like people are so obsessed with the theory almost and not about the kind of doing when it comes to publishing. I mean, and I kind of like, we were talking about this earlier, I like to kind of find out about people's experiences, and I really hope that we'll get that today. I think we will.
I mean, if we look across the sort of occult publishing spectrum, so many occult books are written on this is how you do this thing, this is the theory behind it, and all of those books, if they've been written by a practitioner, we get very little of what the practitioner actually thinks themselves. Kenneth Grant might be an example of someone who also writes about some of the crazy stuff that he got up to with his group. But now we're going to look at, or speak to some people and find out what they're up to in the 21st century.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting. Let's go check that out now. Peter and Alkistis, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks for coming on again, Pete, at such short notice. And, we didn't have you on that long ago, but it's good to have you back.
No, it's my pleasure, Ken. Always good to talk to you guys. And Sitting Now doing such a great job with the podcast. It's excellent to support it.
Thank you, Ken and Ulysses.
Well, I thought the best way to open up this show today would be to kind of, rather than do the brief biography thing, which we do, on most of our shows, is to actually just talk about how you guys kind of met. And actually, Pete and Alkistis, I'd like to know, would you talk a bit about kind of your backgrounds, kind of esoterically speaking, as in like, how did you get into magic, and how did you get into the occult, that kind of thing. And maybe let's do a bit of a sort of history deep dive, as it were, on Scarlet Imprint.
Okay, well, if I start,
yeah, that makes more sense.
Probably easiest. So I've been interested in the occult since I was at university. So I was a radical atheist as a teenager, and I was also a revolutionary Marxist. I was looking at the ways that we could change the world, and I was also reading a lot of existentialist literature. And the existentialist literature led me into reading texts like Colin Wilson's Occult and Mysteries. And I was friends with one of Colin Wilson's sons when I was a teenager. So there was a connection there. And while I was at university, I began to explore magic more and more as I became increasingly disillusioned with a materialist worldview. And I performed the kind of experiments that people do when they're getting into magic. And a friend of mine had bought a copy of the Thoth Tarot, and she forced it on me because it frightened her so much. And so I was kind of forced into Crowley through this being thrust into my hands. And then I spent the next period of time like diving into secondhand bookshops and picking up everything I could do and performing my own experiments. And gradually my worldview changed, also with the use of consciousness altering techniques, including but not limited to psychedelic drugs, and spirit contact. And so my magical career, I found that Crowley was perhaps the clearest writer out there in a sea of largely absolute nonsense. So I pursued diligently the work as laid out within Crowley's texts, and then I worked with various individuals privately in small groups, and I continued to pursue things. I was extremely briefly in the Ordo Templi Orientis, who I discovered were magically incompetent and not worth any of my time. Obviously, different camps may vary, but my experience was extremely negative. So I continued to follow my own path and work on the Red Goddess. And the Red Goddess is a text that I wrote over a period of at least 7 years, and that's 7 years of ritual work. And the culmination of the ritual work was the appearance of Alkistis, in a similar way that you see when Crowley's going through the checklist with Rose in terms of the stele of revealing, and she's coming out with consistently the correct signs, unbidden and without knowing what she was being asked for. Alkistis provided all of the signs in quite remarkable ways. Obviously, that's the personal relationship that we have, and I'm not putting any grand cosmic significance on that. But it must be understood that Scarlet Imprint is the result of at least a 7-year Babalon working, which has produced the most successful modern magical publishing company in the modern age. So, in terms of magical work, I'm always based on success. Success is thy proof. And the proof of the work that I've done is the proof of Scarlet Imprint and the impetus that is given to the new magical revival. And that's been helped by the many people, the many practitioners and individuals who we've been fortunate enough to publish, who've also driven the work forward and really transformed the modern occult. So that's my brief version. Alkistis has a slightly different one.
I have a very different story. My background is, I mean, I don't think I was ever not involved in the occult, even when I didn't even have a word for it, because I was a very strange child and I had very unworldly experience. Oh, well, they are worldly, but otherworldly experiences from a very young age. But I had a strong interest in the Tantric and Chinese and Southeast Asian traditions when I was at SOAS studying. And I became interested in these, practically a lot of the dance and the theatre of Southeast Asia and Japan as well. And so I practiced this and was more interested in that side of things and not having any sense that there was a Western magical tradition at all. But while I was, when I had left university, I began dancing Buto dance. And part of the exploration for that was also exploring everything about my body. So I would, or bodies in general. So I studied a lot of other traditions like shiatsu, or I was apprenticed to a dominatrix, and I would work to pay for my classes by assisting her, things like that, just very wild and experimental, dancing with underground bands in London and just getting as much experience and throwing myself into this sort of erotic and creative and completely bohemian and untethered and unmoored life. But I had a chance encounter with someone who I'd met in a previous life, who had been to Peru, I think, or Brazil rather. No, he'd been to Brazil and had experienced ayahuasca there. And so he brought me into the Santo Daime church in the UK, and I started drinking ayahuasca. 2 weeks after I had a 10-day working, which was close to Zena in Cornwall, which was, I think, 2005, the summer of 2005. 2 weeks after that, which was a huge experience, I had a vision while I was meditating in a friend's garden. And the vision was of a woman who kept transforming her appearance in front of me, who gave me lots of, she told me so many things that would happen. And then nothing like this had ever happened to me quite like this before. I had done work with a lot of meditation with a dakini called Kurukula. And that was quite freeform, but it was more in line with tantric visions. This was quite different. It was a singular figure who just kept transforming her appearance. And I didn't know who she was, but she was very, very explicit in what she told me. And then sometime after that, I was introduced in another kind of strange twist to Peter by a friend of his who I'd met at a party of someone who had been to the ayahuasca sessions with me. I met Peter and everything just kind of exploded. And that was around the time that you remember we were just talking now about the performance with Foolish People. That was about the same time that I was also just becoming introduced to the Western occult and the sort of magical scene, which I didn't know existed. But through my interest in dance, I had looked, and in magical dance, such as you find in the traditions of Southeast Asia, Japan, India. I was interested to work magically with dance, and I'd been experimenting with this on my own. And then I found an advert by a company called Foolish People, who were looking for actors and performers for a thing they were putting on, a play by John Harrigan. So I went along for an audition, and I got cast as Kisikalila, who is a form of Lilith. And I was meeting Peter at exactly the same time that I was rehearsing this, and this was being rehearsed in Treadwell's when it was in Covent Garden. So I would look at books there, and I picked up The Vision and the Voice, and Peter recommended to me the Book of Lies. So I was sort of starting to explore the Western tradition and doing this magical, like, performance art play, and kind of carrying on with my own explorations in magical body and sort of more shamanic freeform techniques that I was developing through my use of through Buto and through the practical modalities that I was also working with, sort of energy work, qigong or nudan and so on, that I was working with to build energy and transforming that through a performance process. So I came in at a very strange angle through a lot of like magical entanglements, and just crashed into Peter and thought, oh, who do you think you are? You say you're a magician. I'm going to see about that. And kind of declared that I would destroy him. And I'm still trying. So this is kind of my sort of crashing into it somehow. And then Scarlet Imprint started because he would give me pieces of the book he was working on to read. And I would read about the goddess Babalon. And I realized through this reading that the woman I had had a vision of was Babalon, because it was so congruent, the things she had said to me and the things that was written in the Red Goddess. It was a lot to do with sex, sexuality, eros. So it was unmistakable, really.
That's interesting. So how does
and I'm still trying to work out so much of this is still like in process of becoming now.
So how does like Scarlet Imprint work with the two of you? Do you both? I know you both write, but do you kind of build the books together? I assume.
Peter does a lot of the editing, and I do all of the design and the typography and some editing with Peter too when we get to the sort of final stages of a book. But Peter will do all the early editing work on a book, and I will do the sort of the manifesting as a material object.
Oh,
I think we're very lucky, Ken, in that our skills kind of dovetail. So I'm pretty sensitive to text, and so I can really help bring things out with writers. And Alkistis, with her artistic background, both in dance and choreography, giving her a sense of space, but also through painting and all of the other things that she's done. We've discovered that she's got a real gift for typography, to such an extent. I mean, she wouldn't say it, but when we exactly. So when we talk to our fine binder has an extremely high opinion of the work that she's doing in terms of the fine book arts and the production of these typographic objects.
I consider myself very much a student, and I'm in awe of many other typographers, but it has been very nice that he believes in me.
Well, the books look fantastic. I mean, the two you sent me recently, the Red Goddess and the Brazen Vessel. I mean, they're kind of beautiful books. They look amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Obviously, the Red Goddess is kind of. I think when a lot of people think Scarlet Imprint, that's probably the first book they think of. Would you agree on that?
Yeah, I think it is.
It depends. People come in through different. Like many of our writers have different followings and strong reputations in their own right. So I think I don't want Scarlet Imprint to be dominated by that, because I like it to be a space that can hold a lot of different voices that have unique experiences and perspectives. I don't want it to be like us, but I want to bring what the energies that Babalon has and can bring through, this ability to materialize something in the world, something very, very powerful, to infuse it with her force and her energy. I want to infuse that energy into the creation of other talismanic objects for writers whose work we really believe in. So it's very much a labor of love and also community, this bringing together multiple voices, many voices, because I don't think one person has the truth. I think the many voices come together and create a much stronger
Polyphony.
A polyphony, yeah. And I think that's a much stronger way to be in the world, to have community like that. But it was the first book. It was the first book, and it did instigate everything. So there wouldn't be Scarlet Imprint without that. Yeah. And
it's always, I mean, whenever I go to say Watkins in London, I always see the Red Goddess. It's always that book that you just see. it's. I
wonder why that is.
So going back to what I'd quite like to know what got you interested in doing a Babalon working, Pete.
Eros. It's the same thing that drives everyone. I mean, I had a strong, curious sex drive since a very young age, and I've always been interested in pursuing human sexuality, and the sexual force and the creative forces are absolutely intertwined. You know, whether we see that in examples of like the way that Crowley worked, or the way that Parsons was able to meld his erotic force into putting man on the moon, the combination of these two things is inseparable and fascinating. So I've always been drawn to the divine feminine and to this path. So I'm also interested in the work of liberation, the wider work of liberation, and sex is one of the most powerful ways that you can engage in that, and it's one of the things that's been most knotted up, not simply in the West, but globally, in terms of the way that you see Abrahamic religions. My character is you know, both saturnine and martial. So I'm interested in undoing and breaking things, and I'm interested in pursuing some of the more antinomian things, simply because that's within my character. And my undoing of myself, and my learning of myself, and my doing my will has taken me in this direction. It's certainly not the work that I would propose that everyone should pursue, but I think there are tools within it which are more widely applicable to a lot of people.
Yeah, we'll come back to that a bit later, because there's something I want to talk to you about when it comes to people wanting to approach Babalon workings. But one thing I noticed, you know, I might be completely off, but one thing I seem to have noticed, at least after following the release of the Red Goddess, was I found that, especially within kind of thelemic magic and kind of, you know, Western esotericism, on places like, even strange places where you wouldn't expect it, like social media, places like that, there seems to be a rising female presence, like taking the lead almost with this kind of stuff. And do you feel that maybe the Red Goddess and other books like it are kind of helping that to kind of happen?
Yeah, absolutely. When I began it, I mean, I have a lot of friends in the sort of witchcraft tradition, so I'm used to being in magical situations with like quite a lot of women, and a lot of strong women have you know, been important in my magical career. But in terms of the way that the magical scene looks now, certainly more and more women are finding their power and finding their voice within it, and there are more female students coming through, and it's hugely important that women come and ask the questions that only they can ask, because there's still a lot of patriarchal assumptions that need to be undone. There's still a lot of sexism in the culture anyway, but we're in an age where women are coming to the ascendant. And I think that the rise of women and the liberation of women that you see exemplified in the Babalon current, both when you see the kind of women who Crowley was associating with, and also the kind of women like Marjorie Cameron who Parsons was associating with. This stream of strong, independent female artistic practitioners is growing and growing, and that, I think that's something that the Red Goddess has helped open up, and I think that continues to be opened up as more and more women find their voices. Yeah,
it's I mean, Ulysses and I often talk about kind of traditional, you know, going back to Crowley and more traditional magical writings. Women always feel more like an instrument than a participant, if that makes sense. Like they always feel that it almost have, I mean, should we use the term we use? I don't know. But, you know.
Yeah, women is treated within thelemic magic very often as a receptacle for the golden sperm.
A fleshlight with a pulse.
And there's no volition. I mean, there is a longer, nuanced conversation to have around sex magic and Crowley sex magic there, but essentially, yes, women have been seen as an accessory, and women have been
facilitate the work of the mages, but not as practitioners or magicians in their own right.
Yeah,
and that doesn't in Crowley's system, from as I understand it, and that's largely through my discussions and work with Peter. It doesn't attribute any creative capacity or force to women. individually as herself. She needs a man in order to be something in this world magically, which is obviously completely insane and is based on completely false assumptions about male and female psychology and physiology and sexuality and so on. So I think although Crowley himself was groundbreaking in many ways and absolutely radical for his time, there are also so many limitations in terms of how much further we've come since then and how much further we've still got to go. So that you can't see Crowley as the last word in this, but really as one of the first words in this discovery of the potential of sex and of eros as powers and as imaginal spaces with which to engage with this work.
And do you think, I mean, obviously we have this like massive catalogue of kind of ritual and, magical writing. Do you feel maybe we should be tearing those up and writing new rituals, or should we be adapting old rituals and old practices? What's your kind of take on that?
I think you should take the conservative perspective and not destroy things that you don't understand. And I think there is sometimes a temptation to destroy things or dismiss them before you actually understand how things work. And I think that's one of the problems that we see in the decentralized world with the breakdown of the orders, is that people are more tempted to just go on a shopping spree in the spiritual supermarket, but not really quite understand the history of the ingredients or how things go together, and that there is a reason for many of the things that have been done. So certainly, yes, there is new work to be done. There are new rituals that are required.
I mean, from my perspective, and this is looking at the Western tradition, not just Crowley, but before Crowley, the whole magical, Solomonic, Goetic traditions, there's no female practice written particularly. There's the unwritten witchcraft, but there is no like magical practice that's specifically female or for oriented around women's physiology, psychology, psyche, and so on. And so my approach to doing ritual has been to be completely creative and to create my own from scratch, which I do through art and through my own process, engaging both with my body and with the deeper mythologies that underlie the force that is Babalon. And I think in a way, as a woman, that's given me a kind of freedom that men already have systems that are designed around and for and by them. And as a woman, those don't exist for me. So I had to create my own. And that suited me temperamentally too, because I'm very independent and creative. I'm not very good at following somebody else anyway. I'm sort of more of an instigator than a follower. But I've appreciated that freedom, although it took me some time to really understand how that related to what everybody else was doing in magic. So I often found myself outside, and I still am outside very much the mainstream discourse on magic, because I've taken a very independent line in that, because that was the only way I could find to do magic as a woman and through my own body and experience. And I think there's a different challenge for men as for women now, coming to this new understanding between working together and also independently, how we take things forward. But certainly as a woman, I find that there's actually so little behind in terms of what's being done specifically by women compared to what men have inherited in terms of tradition, that I think that there are traps and there are advantages to both. And it's just sort of interesting to see the practitioners dealing with that now, and how I hope we're contributing to the ability of people to recognize that there are other paths through this work than just that, the rituals that have already been written and performed, which often are based in kind of erroneous worldviews and understandings of things, especially sex magic, especially thelemic sex magic, which is, largely where it's come from.
Yeah, I mean, one way to think about it, Ken, that I find useful is to draw a parallel with the martial arts. So it can be extremely useful to study a traditional martial art. Any of the Japanese traditional martial arts have like an internal beauty and like significant skills and life lessons that people can learn from them. However, they may not be the most effective weapons in a street fight. So I think that people should train traditionally, but then they should look at the world around them, and they should perhaps look at more of a mixed martial arts approach and see if they can take the best things from other systems once they have a grounding in one. But if you don't have that initial grounding, then you just end up with a mess.
Yeah, that's interesting. So let's actually have a look at our Lady Babalon, and sort of let's historically look at her. I think that's probably the best way to approach this. Obviously, when most people think of like the kind of origin of Babylon, a lot of them look to Revelations, but actually, especially in the Red Goddess, you talk to this. She appears much earlier than that.
Yeah, Revelation is such a difficult text because it contains within it the understanding that you have a deep exegetical understanding of the entire canon of what became the Bible. So Revelation itself is based on texts like Daniel. It's based on Ezekiel. There's a huge amount of, and Enoch. There are a huge amount of embedded texts within Revelation itself, and then Revelation itself is written in a code which is talking about the events which are occurring in the time that John finds himself, with the Christian persecution going on, with the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. And so he's created a massively complex text.
Revelation itself is like a cup that all of these traditions have flown into. So Revelation is almost like the cup of Babylon itself, that it contains so much, and so much more than it appears to contain. You have also the idea in the Whore of Revelation is of the great goddess, whether that's Kibele or Dea Roma, and also behind her Inanna Ishtar, of course, because she was huge. She was one of the most important goddesses even into the Hellenistic period. And so these understandings that all these figures of the great goddess are contained in the figure of the Whore of Revelation, as well as the various cultures that are mixing in this time, whether that's the Jewish, the early Christian, and Hellenistic, Gnostic. It's all there. So it's a kind of...
It's a holographic text.
Yeah.
So there's... You're mentioning the other goddesses, the sort of proto-Babylon, or other manifestations or sort of archetypal elements. But there's also, certainly for Crowley, there was an awful lot of syncretism, where you sort of make parallels between lots of things and effectively say these are all the same things masquerading under different names, as we see most clearly perhaps with Greek and Roman gods. But when it comes to Babylon, and when it comes to our maybe our kind of post-colonial way of looking at things, there's an element of not all goddesses are Babylon. And just because some things share similar traits, they're not necessarily the same thing. So I wonder if you could kind of unpack slightly the distinctions between when you see some goddesses and currents aligning to be hinting at a greater unity, and other times when you go, that's clearly a goddess that is, I don't know, a goddess of the sea or something that may not have that same correlation.
I think one of the key things to do is to start with name. I mean, name is always important. So when you look at Revelation, Revelation names her as Babylon. So the first port of call is to return to Babylon in order to find out who this goddess is, because the wound in the Jewish psyche occurred with, well, one of the wounds occurred with the captivity in Babylon and the exposure to this particular complex of Near Eastern goddesses, the love goddesses, and particularly we're looking at Inanna and Ishtar as being the
erotic energy and force that is circulating out of this like ancient Uruk originally.
So in terms of the things that you're looking for, you're looking at this collision of love and war and agency and
sex
and the overturning of laws, the breaking of boundaries that you see very much with this goddess. So one of the reasons I wrote The Red Goddess is because there was a lot of loose talk, as you say. The kind of the syncretism that you see in Crowley has led people to identify any goddess they can think of with Babylon, and it's manifestly false. I still see some Thelemites today trying to make a case that Babylon is Hathor or Babylon is Isis, and part of the problem and the reason for this is that Crowley was in an age which was engaged in kind of rampant Egyptosophy. It was excited by the discoveries that were happening in Egypt. And so he dressed up a lot of his revelations, particularly if we look at Liber Val Legis, the Book of the Law in 1904. Crowley doesn't have Babylon in that text at all. Not apparently, but he hides her behind the Egyptian goddess Nuit. Now, there is no sane way you can make that equivalence if you have an understanding of Egyptology. None at all. And Crowley's fans who try to make sense of Crowley's use of Egyptian deities are really falling over their feet when they try to do so. So they try to drag in Nuit, and then because Nuit is described in terms of Isis, they try to drag in ideas of Isis, and this is all tosh. My personal approach is to go to the core texts, and the core texts I go to, first of all, primarily is Revelation, and from Revelation I then go back, well, Revelation and then D and then Parsons, and D Crowley and Parsons. But for the goddesses, I'm looking at the ancient Near East, and I think there are some phenomenal lessons to be learned by going back and looking at Inanna and Ishtar and looking at the material that comes out of that and the way that flows through the ancient Near East, and the way that impacts on all the goddesses you find in the region.
I found a lot of, because there are no mythic stories, there are no myths or tales within Crowley for the gods. They're just almost symbols that stand for ideas. They're very unfleshed in so many ways, despite being so beautifully evoked in some of his texts, such as the Vision and the Voice. But I found that going back to the stories and the myths of Inanna Ishtar, and more even the language, like the words of the priestess and her duenna, really evoke a force that is recognizable whenever she appears. So although I don't think Babylon is Ishtar or Babylon is Inanna, I think there's one force that comes through, and is now a very distinctly atomic force in this age. The goddess that is being born now as Babylon, that is coming and emerging, coming into being now, is the same force, but renewed, endlessly renewed, as though she keeps arriving in new skin and being present in different times. And I find that there's still so much of that energy, especially in the ancient texts, especially in Hedwana's words, that evoke this goddess who has who is just such her force of nature. She's a storm. She is the venom upon the land. She is sex. She is everything in jouissance, in pure rising up. And the words that evoke her are so much more evocative than what you get in later ideas. I don't really think of goddess or god as beings as such. For me, it's a force that exists, that captures our imaginations, our eros, and molds it and takes forms that we respond to. So as phantasms, that it's an energy that is taking form, a force and an energy that is taking form as a particular phantasm or image or persona, mask or something, and can impact you into the very depths of your flesh, but also have this something that completely that is completely beyond that, because it's always coming from the center of the universe. It's always coming from this schism, this divide between what we are. We are like male and female. So Babalon is talked of as a goddess, and I understand why she's perceived in this feminine sense, because all life emerges from the woman. But for me, the energy of Babalon is easily as accessible to a male as a female, and that it's really so much that the way it affects us is through eros and through the erotic and through our imaginal, and this this very plastic and malleable realm in which we are continually playing with, and the play of these forces with us. So especially the stories of Inanna Ishtar evoke that for me, because when you read them and you listen to them, there are readings you can hear online, the original Akkadian and so on, Sumerian. They're very hypnotic, and the words get through the meaning, and also just the sound of the early languages really evoke something quite deep and atavistic inside you. And it goes beyond where I think Crowley was, and it's it's very, very deep. I don't know what else to say about that, but I think it's so recognizable that almost the name doesn't matter. Babalon herself is just the name that attaches her to the land where she first emerged in the historical record.
Great. I was actually going to ask if we could just clarify, for the sake of people that aren't familiar with the term, the distinction between Babylon and Babalon, if there is one. Certainly, but I didn't really want to interrupt what you were saying, because there was some really great stuff in there that I still actually want to pick up on. But I wonder if we could, going back to that sort of Inanna Ishtar and Babylon era, clarify, why do we call her Babalon now, and why are these two words different, and how do people make those distinctions?
Yeah, it's a fairly straightforward thing. So the main reason we find her spell Babalon is Crowley's gematria, which, because the name adds up to 156. And 156 is, amongst other things, the multiple of 12 by 13, which is the rectification of the solar and the lunar years. So there's a tantric formulation in there in terms of the way that the sun and the moon are interacting within the name. That's very important. We also can look at D. So in D uses the spelling Babalon for wickedness. So it's an Enochian word as well. So Crowley is drawing on D, and he's performing an act of gematria in order to distinguish what he's talking about. And this is kind of typical of the period of occultism that he's working in. I don't think it's a huge problem. But one difficulty is that it makes people sometimes mistake Babylon as being a subset of Thelemic magic, when in fact Thelemic magic is a very small subset of the magic of Babylon.
I find this as well, that Crowley created a system and a religion, a philosophy that is largely drawing from Egyptian ideas and gods. But then he takes from Revelation just two figures. They are the harlot of Revelation and the beast. And I find it very strange that there's no particular reason why those figures should fit into this new philosophy, but it's not clear anyway, is it? But I always felt that somehow Babylon being at the heart of this was just her being born into a new age. So the change in name, or the shift in name, actually gives her a new birth, a new kind of coming into being. And that is particularly for this age, and the age which Crowley felt coming, the atomic age, the age where I think quite a revelatory age in so many ways for many aspects, especially in terms of sex. If you think for how long that the relationship between the sex was very, very controlled. And since especially the 60s, but even in Crowley's age, the bohemians and the aristocrats around Crowley and the people on the margins were already trying to experiment with new ways of being, new ways of living, a new way of the sexes relating to each other. And that process has been ongoing since that period, particularly.
I think it's also useful in that it indicates not a different entity, which is sometimes the mistaken reading that I see people make, but a different exegesis. It shows by using this different spelling, this shift in orthography, it makes you ask the question, well, what is this about? And what it's about is a rereading of Revelation in a new Gnostic or heretical fashion, which liberates this figure and transforms her role in a soteriological sense, rather than leaving her as clearly coded for the demonic female. She becomes a much more transformative figure. So there is value in it.
Yeah, I agree.
I think, I mean, moving forward in terms of, I guess, Babylon history, I'd say the next real big kind of appearance of Babylon would be with John Dee. Could you talk to kind of Dee's interpretation of Babylon and like how he kind of filtered him through his system?
I wonder if I could just actually jump in there a moment, Ken, because if we do sort of see on the timeline landmark as Dee as the next kind of the presence where the word Babylon comes from and so forth, what was happening between the period of ancient Babylon and Inanna Ishtar and this Renaissance Enlightenment kind of era when Babylon reappears? How was the current or the force of Babylon moving through? As soon as I'm saying this, I'm immediately seeing witchcraft and so forth. But I want to hear it from you guys as to what the kind of, unless you think it was a broken chain, but what the unbroken chain might have been that led us to the point of John Dee, and then Ken can carry on talking about John Dee.
Yeah, I think you're correct. Witchcraft and so forth. You're in a period where it's very difficult for there to be any records of non-standard religious beliefs or readings surviving in a useful fashion through that period. So it's also you're also looking at an invention that we're casting back into the past if you're trying to fill those gaps, right? Because we don't have the records of practitioners or thinkers that are outside the orthodoxy, and we can posit that may be because they ended up on the pyre, but that's also overwriting the reality of many just poor women. And
it's not just women. It's the thing is, if sexuality is so controlled and people's lives are so difficult that they don't have the opportunity to explore those things, then it's not going to blossom. And the Renaissance did bring back this return of the pagan gods in a way, even if it was quite a heavily Christianized way in those cases. But it brought back these ideas, smuggled it in. And so with D, you get a period which is opening up again to what was forbidden for so long, because these texts just weren't available. It was just revelation. It was just the Bible pretty much throughout Europe through those times. And in terms of the way people could live, I think there were just so many conditions on how lives could be lived. Even it's not just female sexuality that was constrained, it was male sexuality too. So you have an age in which, I don't really know enough about that. I think it's very interesting if you read, for example, Federici, although this is actually the early modern period, Silvia Federici, but it's very interesting in terms of her discussion of how bodies were so controlled in order to be productive and to be functional to people who owned those bodies or controlled
this is the author of Caliban and the Witch?
Caliban and the Witch.
Great.
So although we have some questions over some of the way she presents the material, it's very very Marxist materialist, and she doesn't credit there being a spiritual component to any of the witchcraft material. But still, I think it gives a sense of the material conditions that ordinary people lived through. So perhaps extraordinary people could do something in their own privacy, but this is not like something that is on the record.
Yeah. And again, if you look at like later cases, like say the Isabel Gaudi material that comes through by mistake, those kind of like, those kind of testimonies were really overwritten by the way in which cross-examinations were carried out. Everything was brought down to the devil and was made to fit purpose. So you wouldn't get dramatic other visions of like the world coming through.
But sexuality itself is so demonized. So with all the witchcraft and the demonologist material, it was so much of it putting a sense of fear and forbidding any exploration of sexuality, anything that wasn't, completely, you have sex in order to have children and that's it, and there's no pleasure there. So this sense, and it's still there in Christianity now, it's not like it's completely gone. There is so much taboo around the body and pleasure. And I think that it's irrepressible in one sense. And so it's not that these things can be broken, and I don't see it in a completely linear way. I think this is a force that is in the body all the time. And it can always emerge when it's given an opportunity to. So even if it doesn't make the historical record, it's still a presence within people.
So does that mean then that we might think that its legacy within the historical record is, we're seeing that with John Dee, a wealthy, aristocratic, was he aristocratic? No, just a member of the court, of a man of privilege, being able to engage in ostensibly heretical activities of truck with angels rather than mediated by a priest on his behalf. He wouldn't have
perceived it as heretical, though. I mean, he certainly wouldn't have assumed that he was dealing with the whore of Babylon, for sure. He would have been horrified at the idea that he was doing something that was unchristian and ungodly.
Oh God,
I
absolutely.
think that what's happening is that this energy, this force is there, and I think a lot of it has to do with Edward Kelly, and I think a lot of it has to do with the particular eros and chemistry around those four, particularly Kelly, Dee, and their wives.
So do we actually have much input or sort of secondary information about their wives in regards to how they fit into this sort of four-part equation between these two husband and wife pairings? Or do we just really know anything from Dee and Kelly's potentially at odds sort of positions?
My understanding is we only have the male record. We only have Dee and Kelly.
But from what Dee wrote, his wife wasn't too keen on the cross. How would you say?
Okay, so we at least have then Dee mentioning something about his wife's opinion on the matter.
Yeah, she wasn't happy about it, but I think she submitted to his.
Yeah, I think one of the problems, Ulysses, is that when people think about Dee and the angelic material, they make a series of errors. One is they talk about like the Enochian universe as if it exists in some parallel dimension and is separate to the universe. And the second thing is that they mistake Dee for being a magician when Dee is in fact a Christian through and through. Like shot through, and the magic that they're performing, they believe to be entirely lawful Christian magic, and they're working within the parameters of the Christian universe. Although the problem for them is that they get increasingly strange material coming through as a result of Kelly's scrying, leading up ultimately to the appearance of the Daughter of Fortitude and the cross matching, the sexual wife swapping that occurs between the two of them. It's a very vexed and complicated subject, the Dee material. But there is a sense, as we talked previously about rupture and breaking through and the new occurring and new dispensations. There's very much a sense of those threads.
Dee actually understood, I think Dee understood as a Christian that in order for there to become a new covenant with God, which was what he was trying to accomplish, that they would have to transgress in order to establish that new covenant. So he was willing to go to these further reaches of what was considered Christian or permissible within a Christian framework, because he was actually trying to establish a new and perfected Christianity and a new and perfected nature. But it wasn't at any time meant to be unchristian. It was always godly.
Yeah, I mean, the clincher was when he was, well, when they were told by the angels, there is nothing unlawful which is lawful unto God, which is, one of those like great terrifying spiritual truths which push them over the edge into engaging in this experiment
and breaking the group.
Yeah, and ultimately sundering the entire operation.
Did Dee get to a point where he, having generated this material with Edward Kelly, that he ultimately rejected it and went, "I'm having none of this. This is taking me," or was he persuaded by it? Obviously, he was persuaded in parts of his life in order to actually engage in these activities.
I think he was a true believer. I think he was a true believer, and he kept pursuing the material like long after Kelly had left, with less and less success. But he certainly continued to pursue it.
And was he tapping into the Babalon aspect of?
No, absolutely not.
Right.
No.
So sort of Babalon sort of makes a sort of guest appearance in his working from his point of view, and then he carries on with the rest of his godly duty.
And there's always the figure of Medimi, who runs through their engagements with the angels and who seems to transgress between the spirit world and their world frequently.
Can you say a bit more about who this figure is?
Medimi, she appears first as a young girl, and she sort of grows up and sort of becomes increasingly sexual, and she's the one who talks about her as she sort of reaches adolescence and her sort of coming of age, and she's the one who talks about her mother coming, and that's the figure we associate with the woman who is described as the daughter of fortitude. But Madimi herself is very, like, has elements of this. She's coquettish, she's all kinds of trouble for them as a spirit. What would you say about?
And again, you see kind of like this tripartite kind of Babylon figure in Crowley's vision and the voice as well. So, you know, there's the daughter figure who appears in the ethers as well in one of the visions. So,
and there's this strange resonance and relationship between mother and daughter, which you see even like throughout, even in life, in humans, that the daughter is the mother, and the mother, they're alike. They're so alike that they're the same. So you can see that the mother is renewed through the daughter, and that creates a strange energy, because the sort of this erotic nature is always being reborn again and again. So this is why I can't understand that there needs to be a linearity or an unbroken connection, because it's continually welling up inside you as well. The connection, the erotic force is continually able to erupt into your life. And that's part of the nature of Babalon. And I see that with the way that she, either the figure of Madimi or the figure of the daughter of fortitude, erupts into the scrying sessions of Dee and Kelly. It can't be kept out.
Interesting. Babylon does seem to appear at these kind of nexus points throughout history as well, which is kind of interesting. Yes. And I mean, the obvious next one to talk about would be Jack Parsons, who we spoke about at length the last time we had you on, Peter. But can we talk a little bit about, because I think this is kind of interesting, because I think it might have had an influence or some kind of fuel to Jack Parsons' Babylon working. It's Kenneth Grant's interpretation of Babylon, which seems to be kind of broken by historical inaccuracy, but I mean, he's a great read, but I'm not sure how much stock you should put into some of his history. Let's put it that way. But what kind of influence did Kenneth Grant, would you say, have on the kind of the sort of historical lineage of Babylon?
Grant's a curious one. Grant's very curious. Grant knew Crowley when Crowley was an old man and Grant was like a fresh-faced boy. So Grant was 20 when he was serving as Crowley's secretary. So he was really wet behind the ears. The old master was kind of like on the way out, and was also quite frustrated at the way that Grant responded to the material and the teachings that he was giving him. So Grant produces a very strange version of something which I don't think you can call Thelema in any useful way. And I don't think he says anything useful about Babylon either, because the way that it has to go through Grant's crazy personal mythology scrambles anything that might be useful. However, what Grant does is Grant keys into the idea of the Scarlet Woman as the tantric Suvasini, the woman who produces the transformative kalas that the male magician and potentially her use for magical transformation. So Grant rewrites the Crowley script. So Crowley's universe is entirely spermanostic. So the creative principle in Crowley is the sperm, and woman is nothing but woman does not have a soul in Crowley for a start. If you read Liber Aleph, and her only hope is to be reincarnated as a man in her next incarnation. This is like, one of the major problems with Crowley. His view of women is pretty abominable in some ways. There are other parts you can quote which make it sound a lot better. So Crowley was all about sperm in terms of sex magic, and Grant flips this on its head and he makes it all about the Kalas. He makes it all about the sexual emanations of the trained priestess. Now, Grant got this idea from a guy called David Kerwin. And David Kerwin was a tantric initiate who had contacted Crowley, again, late in Crowley's life. And Kerwin had a tantric teaching which he'd received from a group in India, which was essentially a commentary on a single text. And this talked about the importance of the Kalas, and he argued with Crowley about this because this group had also read some of Crowley's writings and were negatively commenting on it at the time. So Kerwin took this female-centered Kala material, and Crowley introduced him to a young Kenneth Grant, because Crowley needed Kerwin to hand over the money to make him a 9th degree in order to finance Crowley in his old age. So Kerwin didn't believe that the OTO or the AA or any of Crowley's things were anything other than like words written on paper. He didn't think there were any people. He thought it was just a shell game. And so in order to prove that there was a viable group, Crowley introduced Kerwin to Grant. And Kerwin introduced Grant to this tantric teaching on the importance of the Kalas.
And Grant ran with it.
And Grant really ran with that. And that's, again, like if we're talking about initiation, this is a pretty slim piece of information that Kerwin has handed over, that Kerwin has got through a correspondence course from people he's never met.
Not exactly initiated, it's correspondence
and
course.
He hasn't
had Shaktipat, he hasn't actually been communicated in any methodology. He doesn't seem to be a practitioner of any kind. There's no material, nothing on the record that suggests he knows what to do. And in fact, there's quite the opposite. There are things that happened that suggest he was taken advantage of.
Yeah, there's a famous bit where Crowley sends him off to, I think, to see John Simmons to buy like to buy some Suvasini juice, to buy some female elixir, and yeah.
And he believes it. He goes along there and asks for it. And the guy just laughs at him, like, are you joking?
So Kerwin gives Grant this. Now, the positive thing about Grant is that Grant addresses the complete absence or denigration of the female principle within Thelemic magic. And he does so at a time when feminism and witchcraft in England in particular,
and in America.
But I'm talking about the English experience, really are taking off in a big way. So my interest in the Grant material is that he makes the equal and opposite error to Crowley. So Crowley simply spermagnostic, and Grant is just all about the Kalas. And Grant really like goes off the deep end with all of his material in a way which I think is deeply unhelpful for students, but can be an evocative, great fun read for people who can keep their feet on the ground.
So the subject of the Kalas, which come up in a lot of Grant's works, is, and you're saying through Kerwin, is this kind of erroneous material, or is this misunderstood sort of Indo-Asian material, and in which case is there a more direct source that we can look at for that type of material, or is that actually just entirely separate to Grant's championing of the sort of female energy in a broader sense?
Yeah, I think when you try to piece together a practice or any kind of sense out of the Typhonian trilogies as to regarding the actual practice of sex magic, Grant is next to useless. Whether he knew anything or not, again, like I'm looking at the source of Kerwin, and I'm doubtful that he has anything really beyond inspiration from that. Particularly given the way that he responds to Crowley's material, and the wild way that he riffs with that. I imagine he also riffed wildly with Kerwin's material and similarly. But certainly, you know, there is the option of just going back to the roots and pursuing tantra. But
that's not Thelema, as
that's
Crowley.
not Thelema, as Crowley points out.
Okay,
you know,
then
Crowley,
from a
Crowley's very
Babalon
clear.
sense,
In a Babalon sense,
is,
I think what you can take from Grant is you can say that the female principle has been absolutely overlooked, like culturally and magically, and Grant kind of helps to kind of point things in a more useful direction.
I think one of the interesting things about Grant is that he does attribute a much more active role to the woman through the office of the Scarlet Woman. And this in itself harks back even to the earliest appearances of this force, this divine force, Babalon, as Inanna Ishtar, when you have the figure, both the goddess Inanna and Ishtar and her priestess are described as Nugig. So the word Nugig is translated usually as Hierodule, and is kind of the equivalent to Scarlet Woman in the sense that both Babalon as a goddess, but also her earthly office as a priestess is described as a Scarlet Woman. So you have this kind of equivalence where both Nugig and Scarlet Woman refer to goddess and person at the same time, both to the sort of divine energy and principle and to the human incarnation. So in that sense, the image of the Scarlet Woman never had that kind of completeness in Crowley, but in Grant it starts to get that sense of coming into prominence and coming into a much clearer outline about there is a potential role for women through this, that both is a challenge that the goddess or the force herself throws out and puts upon women to fulfill or to explore, but also there's the sense that it's an equivalence as well, that something earthly is, something on earth is the thing it is, so that it's not just something that stays in Crowley. I think he tries to keep Babalon so much above the abyss, and so she remains almost as a potentiality that he can discard his Scarlet Women. He's never actually ridden and controlled by them. He's always in control. With the figure of the Scarlet Woman in Grant, it seems quite different and quite opposite, that the figure of the magician, the male magician, is sort of subservient to the female energy.
Yeah, I'm going to push back.
Okay, push back.
I'm going to push back on that just with the example of his relationship with Leah Hersig in Cefalù.
Yeah.
There was certainly a strong period where Leah appeared to be leading the dance in terms of like pushing him to greater and greater excesses.
With their transgressions.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then when he tired of her, he discarded her.
Yeah, absolutely.
So she doesn't have an office for life in the way he has as the beast.
No.
Whereas I think in Grant, you get a sense that the woman can take on this role and identify both with the goddess and as her priestess in a way that hasn't really, it is very much part of this period of the sexual revolution that, okay, now women have the vote, women can have their own bank accounts, women can start to explore their sexuality because there's the pill. And it's all still very much in some sort of kind of tumult, and nothing is settled yet, but there's a sense of a great world opening up. And I think that Crowley presages that, but still tries to keep a lot of control over what this force actually is, even though he's invoking it and definitely wants this, he invokes this particular woman.
Yeah.
But much stronger in Grant is the idea that she has her own will, and that isn't really a feature in Crowley's understanding of the Scarlet Woman. But for me, the difficulty with the Scarlet Woman is just that the word itself, the term itself, is derogatory. So although you could say it's like reclaiming it and turning it into something that has power, I still think that there's so much tied up in terms of it's a label that's put on a woman. So yes, there's power in scarlet and power in red and power in this, but it's still so tied to a chastisement of this. This is my personal feeling. This is my personal history too, because my grandmother was labeled a Scarlet Woman. So I have like a strong reaction to it. I never heard it and felt it as a kind of form of power, but I always felt the reverberations of that effect that my grandmother was labeled a Scarlet Woman for the way she had lived, and she had been excommunicated and so on and so on. So it had a reverberation that went down through generations in my family because of that term. So there is power in it, but I'm not sure that as a term itself, it is the one that brings the most strength to a woman's own identity as herself.
I just find it a bit Victorian.
Yeah, it's a bit Victorian too. It's dated, but this is why I never use this term in my own writings or work, because I just don't find it in any way useful now. I find it too much tied up with so many chastising and dated conceptions of what it is to be a woman who has a sexual nature.
So we've seen Crowley drawing ideas of Babylon and sort of changing them from Dee rather, and changing them, and then Grant sort of twisting them even in a completely different direction. But how did that kind of colour the way Jack Parsons then engaged with Babylon, do you think? There must have been some kind of, discoloration or, coloration of what he was attempting to do, via, at least through Crowley. I mean, I'm not sure how well versed he was in Grant at that point.
Grant came afterwards.
Parsons
Parsons is pre-Grant.
Parsons is pre-Grant. Parsons is
and pre-Gardner.
No, but it's understandable. I mean, there was this kind of like gulf between the two places. I mean, Grant was writing, trying to get hold of more information about what had happened with Parsons, and certainly he was one of the early people to like champion the work of Jack in terms of including material on Parsons in the Typhonian trilogies, and also I think it's important to credit Michael Staley for the work that he did in Starfire on talking about Parsons. There are really positive things about that. I don't want people to feel that I'm just like talking trash about Kenneth. I think Kenneth is still really important. I think he did some fascinating work, and I think that it would have been nice to hear more from Steffi. And what her experience was, but her art speaks. So I think she's also entitled to her silence.
Yeah, true. But yeah, I mean, so Parsons' experience with Babylon is obviously, I mean, we discussed this at quite length in the last, but maybe we should touch on it. I mean, it does seem like I was saying earlier that he's at this kind of nexus. I mean, I think Babylon appears at these kind of nexus points, but then I think Jack Parsons himself appeared at a nexus point, didn't he? Where the kind of old and new kind of collide in a way. So you have the kind of almost the old Aeon-y, if you can call it that, Crowley kind of era, and then you have this new incoming renaissance of magic, and he seems to be right at the kind of meeting point of those two things, doesn't he?
Yeah. Jack is really at a catalytic moment, and he takes full advantage of that. He really epitomizes like the best aspects of Thelema in terms of his championing of the ideas of individual freedom, of liberty, of sexual liberation, of the role of women, of, obviously there are some problems with his nascent feminism, but like his heart is absolutely 1000% in the right place. And he's able to do something which no one else has been able to do in terms of he's brought through a document which has the sense, like the taste, the feeling of the goddess in it. It has this transformative power which is still able to transform people. So the work of Jack is still, there's still a lot more to unfold from that.
There's still work of Jack that hasn't been published.
Only a little.
Only a little bit.
Only a little, sitting in the archives.
But his work was also cut short rather dramatically and before his time. So you feel like it was necessary to pick up where he left in our age and keep going.
So one thing that seems to be apparent with Babalon, but just in general, when you sort of do workings with deities or entities or whatever you want to call them, there seems to be a kind of infusion of their influence on say performance or writing. Or how did you find when you worked with Babalon, how did you find that it kind of infused with your kind of performances or writing or that kind of thing? How was that kind of different to say other workings you've done, or do you see what I mean?
For me, all the workings that I have done, performances, relate to Babalon. So I couldn't describe it being with anything else.
So this is the problem. The problem, Ken, is the once you embrace the all blood into the cup formula, which is like the simple formula, there is nothing else.
Right.
So that there is no dividing line in the work we do.
Even when something is apparently the subject is something else, but still what's driving this is questions that she has given me or that are tearing at me that I have to answer, and the answers are always in the body and through the body. So I think this is also why there's a very strong aspect to Babalon that requires embodiment, requires manifestation through the body, that it demands to come into the world, and that's how it transforms the world. So I think we have a moment now where more and more people are responding to this and bringing these energies through into the material world. And I think that's very distinctly part of this birthing of a new age, a new consciousness, without trying to sound too new age. I don't think it's all like I don't think it's all positive either. I think her energies are very, very potentially dangerous in the sense that they are really hard to work with. The erotic energy and sexual energy is not a force that you can contain or control. There's no, and even having the relationship we do, it's completely one of freedom in the sense that we can't take anything for granted. We just give everything to this, and I feel that somehow we're just here to keep doing that. It's very hard to explain.
So in terms
but there's an incarnate aspect to her, and as well as a sort of an unspeakable or mystic aspect to her. It's very similar. I think about it similarly to in traditional, in sort of Christianity, there is a concept of the Antichrist. There are two Antichrists. So this is one of the references that Peter's book refers back to, the title. Although it's about Parsons and Hubbard, it also refers to the Christian conception of there always being two Antichrists, a mystical Antichrist and a great Antichrist who incarnates on earth. And I think in terms of Babalon as there being a Babylon Mystica and also Babylon Incarnata, which is multiple, that this force can emanate and manifest through many, many, many people, potentially infinite people who open up to this energy and force and bring out things into the world through this energy.
So in regards to this energy and this force, for people exploring the esoteric realms and sort of engaging with their body and with the sort of more insubstantial elements, or not insubstantial, what do I mean? The non-physical elements and the physical. What other sort of are there some keys or landmarks or something that you would sort of describe that would help people navigate their experience, and in order to know, am I sort of engaging with a Babylonian current, or am I how to determine
how to recognize. There's a very clear energetic signature. It's very, very hot and You see, I've spoken to a few people that have written to us asking for help. You will get very overwhelming and very strongly physical manifestations of this energy in your body through you, and very strong electrical sense. It feels like you're being reconstructed, not reconstructed, like you're lighting up. You feel increasingly luminous, and this is my experience anyway, over working for, I guess, coming to 16 years or so with this force, this particular one. An increasing luminosity, an increasing sense of space. The space is always, your sense of your body opens up and becomes absolutely as if a landscape, but one which is in continual turmoil. I spoke a little bit about this when I was doing the work on Venus called Visitation, because I likened this sense of Babalon being in the body to also the surface of Venus as a planet, which is so volatile and so volcanic and so full of this, that it's so volcanic and energetic that the surface itself is continually reconfiguring. And I feel like Babalon has this imprinting on the body, that this energy working through you will and does continually remake you and relight you. And that there is a way of working with that that is more controlled by gradually finding the way you... it's so hard to explain in words. For me, it's very, very intuitive, and I work very, very directly into the body, into the matter of it through movement. So I would say movement is one of the key things, both how you would recognize her, particular movements and a particular quality and a particular kind of passionate existence and a particular way of seeing the world and experiencing the world, rather. But
okay, well, taking that as a no, that's great, and thank you for wrangling with trying to put into words these things that really do evade our sort of linguistic side.
I do.
So so you're talking about some sort of signals there, and I wonder then if we can roll it back a tiny bit. Again, I'm imagining people beginning to engage in magical practices or broader. And so I'm wondering what sort of preparatory work might might open up pathways for people to tread down in order to approach these experiences.
Personally, my experience was quite spontaneous, and the people that I've heard from had similarly spontaneous experiences, but often they happen through an encounter where I think very similar to what happened with Peter, that the combined energies, the sort of alchemy of two people, the chemistry is greater than the sum of its parts and creates a sort of a strange sort of fusion. And that's been my experience. So I think there is an element of you can't prepare for it. It's like being struck by lightning. It's like the thing that just happens and you can't know it. But if you want to devote yourself to that, then I think it's very close to a kind of tantric practice. One has to live in a way in which one gives everything for this, in which one is open to everything. You're continually working on yourself. I mean, before I met Peter, for years, I was doing a lot of body work, a lot of work with energy, qigong, nudan, and so on, nudan, and these erotic practices, Chinese and especially, and through working with Glenn Morris, or his guidance anyway. So I had a lot of energetic preparation for it, and I had a lot of energy. If you're coming to it, I would work on clearing all the blockages in the body, because she's going to do that. So I would work on absolute truth to oneself, absolute truth in one's dealings with the world, a kind of integrity, because without those kind of safety nets almost, it's very confusing. You can get very lost in the turbulence. One of the dangers of working with Babalon is that the energy is so strong, and what she does initially and for some time is to massively amplify and to blow up everything that sort of she finds in you, as though she's working through your body and through your psyche, and amplifying and pushing and breaking, testing things to the limit, testing you. And you can mistake this for Babylon. You can mistake yourself for this goddess. And it's more that she amplifies something about you before she totally breaks you. And that's going to come. And that breaking can be managed better by having a kind of radical honesty with the way one goes about everything one does in life, essentially, in one's dealings with other people. In this degree of honesty really helped me anyway. It's been one of the key things that has kept me grounded throughout. So I would say also having a very rigorous grounding practice. If you're beginning to work with these energies, it's impossible to also maintain this 24/7. It's so strong that you actually need to be able to put the energy into something. So you would need to have an altar and have a chalice, a statue, a figure, some objects that you can charge with the energy, that you can contain the energy, so that you can keep it in a place where it's not always playing with you. If you allow it to continually work with you, it will burn you out. When I was working on the new edition of the Red Goddess last year, and it was like over Christmas and New Year, it was a sustained period of a few weeks, like 3 weeks to a month, where I was I couldn't sleep. I was working all the time. When I wasn't working, I was unable to rest. I was in a completely erotically charged and creatively fixated period, and so sustained. My health wasn't very good at the time either, and this just made it worse. So that essentially, after I got that book and the Two Antichrists out, I just collapsed for the rest of the year. So even I, with my experience and training, wasn't able to have such a sustained engagement with something, to bring something like this through all the time for like 4 weeks. So there has to be a process of habituating the body to these energies, acclimatizing to it to be able to contain the force. So there has to be a way of grounding it. And the best thing is just to be in nature, to go for walks in forests, on ground, to feel the earth under your feet, be in the sea, give yourself to the elements, and make that sacrifice into the cup, into the greater cup that is her cup. I think that's the first guidance that I can think of.
No, that's great. That's great, Keith. That's great. Thank you.
Well, I think that's a great place to end today. What are you guys up to? Printing wise, work wise. What are you bringing us next?
So we've just opened the pre-order on Gordon White's new book, Animistic, which I think has been our most successful pre-order ever.
It's gone crazy.
And I think our readers are entirely right. I think this is a very important book that Gordon's produced. We're then going to...
The cover's beautiful, by the way.
Thank you. Yes, yeah, she's great.
Thank you.
And then we're doing, then we're reissuing J. Stratton Kent's True Grimoire. We're doing an updated version of that because that's been actually out of print for a little while.
In hardback.
Does an updated version mean the truer grimoire?
The truer grimoire, yeah, even truer.
The even truer grimoire. Sorry, Peter,
this
carry
is the
on.
true one.
And then we got the
Holy Heretics, the third one in Frater Arcus Holy Diamond Cycle. And we've got lots more stuff in the works, and we're both completely engaged in our own mad writings and projects and workings that is sort of...
So it's furious. We're being driven by the erotic energy of Babylon and pouring everything into the cup.
Essentially.
Excellent.
Delicious.
That sounds great. Thanks so much, guys. That was it was really good to have you back on.
No, great to speak, guys. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for that. That was great. Thanks, guys.
Oh, happy.
Yeah.
Oh, that was so difficult. So sorry that I'm a bit.
You plugged in.
No. I tell you, the amount of times that I
And we are back. That was a really, really interesting interview, actually. Pete is always great, and it's great to finally have Alkistis on as well. So,
yeah, absolutely. God, there was a lot of material in there. That's, you know, sometimes when you're doing an interview and you don't want sort of dead air where nothing's being said, and at the same time, sometimes you just got to sit and like ponder over some of the things that are being said, and there was a lot of meat to that. Fantastic and exciting.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like I said before, it's a subject I've wanted to cover for quite a long time, and I think we've definitely drilled the right people. Clearly the right people to talk to about Babalon.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of one of their things. I guess, yeah, we'll leave it at that. We're coming back next week with Andy Sharp, and we will. What am I trying to say? Yeah, and we will be talking to him about his English heretic work. Don't forget to check us out on Instagram and on YouTube. Look up the username Sitting Now, SITTINGNOW on both. We're on Facebook. To be fair, I need to start a new Facebook page for us because I have no idea what's happening with our old one. I don't understand how it works, so I need to kind of start a new one, learn it all refresh, and we'll start talking on Facebook as well. But do join us on there because we do try and interact with people whenever possible. And anyway, yeah, we'll see you next week. It was great to see you again. Are you going to be joining us again soon, do you think?
Well, I'll have to fight the other co-host for this comfy chair, but otherwise we'll see. But I hope everyone enjoyed that. We certainly did. There was plenty of, in any silent moments, the two of us just sitting there nodding and looking at each other a hell of a lot.
But, it was fantastic.
So and I hope you were as well.
Yeah, excellent. And we will see you next time.
Bye.
Mm-hmm.